Yes, right now we had one other who tried to join, but then bumped out, and so I'm hoping that they're just maybe having a little blip with their internet connection.
Okay, right. Well, let's start anyway. And as you say, if you record it, they can have a copy of that. Welcome, everybody. It's lovely to be here again. This week, we're going to talk about writing a review paper, which is important for research, and we'll explain why. And then we're going to discuss Stephen's paper, Stephen very kindly sent us his paper on internet addiction. So I've been through it, and we can discuss it and any other questions people have. So it's lovely to see you all again, although we have a small audience, but let's hope that that number grows perhaps during the webinar, but they can also catch up on the recorded side.
Yes, Dr. Hates, I can tell you, we do have a lot of people who view the recording.
Right, good. So should we start the...
Yes. All right, how's that?
That's lovely, that's beautiful. Okay, so this is the 5th session. We're talking about writing a review paper. Now, sometimes I talk about not only review papers, but meta-analysis, but I've decided not to include that because it is very complex, and at the moment I don't think it's worth doing. So writing a review paper is a subject which I think is important for all research or reading review papers. So let's look at the session. So if we can have the next slide, please. A review paper provides a comprehensive and systematic summary of results available in a given field, or make it possible to see the topic under consideration from a new perspective. Paper draws on recent studies by other researchers to make a critical analysis and summarize, appraise, and classify available data, to offer a synthesis of the latest research in a specific subject area, ultimately arriving at new cumulative conclusions. So all that posh language means that we're talking about looking at papers. We are looking at papers on a subject that that you may be researching, and we can get a good idea of what the field is saying about this particular topic at the moment. And a review paper will analyze what's there and classify it. And it's a great help when you are doing your research that you can see what review papers are discussing and what's happening in that particular field. So can we have the next slide? The goals of such a review may be the development of a theory, evaluation of a theory, a survey of the state of knowledge on a specific topic, problem identification, the provision of an historical account of the development of theory and research on a particular topic. So it really covers, so much of the work that we do in terms of developing new theories and also understanding what has happened and what has gone before. And one of the things you have to remember is that there's no research which is entirely new and original. It's all usually based on something in the past. So review papers are immensely important in our research life. Next slide. Review articles are also useful in science and everyday life in policy making. So if you are a policymaker, that's one of the things if you are systematic, is you go to review papers to understand what is happening in that particular area. Review articles have become necessary to advance addiction science by providing a systematic summary of existing evidence while coming up with new ideas and pointing out the unique contribution of the work, which may provide a great challenge for inexperienced researchers. So they've become necessary by providing that summary of what's happening already, and they should come up with new ideas, and this is where we're going to be going. This is what we should be doing. This is the contribution of this work. And if you are an inexperienced researcher, it provides a great help because it provides you with the background of what you can be doing. Next slide. Now, different journals have different criteria for reviews. And one of the things that we've said throughout this series is that if you want to do a paper and have it published, make sure you go to instructions for authors of the particular journal you are wishing to submit to. The journal Addictology, which is published in Prague, and what they say, a cogent summary of topical issues. The author's own experience is not the underlying theme for the paper. So it's not about the author's experience, but it's about the papers that they review. Maximum extent is 16 pages with not more than 50 bibliographic citations. Literature not more than 5 years old should prevail. And that's one of the problems, that sometimes people try to put so many citations in that it becomes huge. Literature not more than 5 years old is relevant if it's as a current topic. But remember, if you are reviewing historical stuff or where a theory came from, you may need to go back many years. So that idea of not more than 5 years is about current literature. Now, the journal Addiction, which is probably the gold standard journal for addictions studies, reviews simply draw together a body of literature to reach one or more main conclusions and up to 4,000 words. So they limit the words number, but there's no limit on the number of citations. So you can see from those two different examples, different journals have different criteria for their review papers. Next slide. Systematic reviews use an explicit literature research strategy, inclusion and exclusion criteria for determining the quality and reliability of the study findings. So they will say quite clearly at the beginning what their inclusion and exclusion criteria are for which studies we'll include in this study. Systematic reviews are replicable and conclusions drawn by the authors more easily verifiable. Systematic review that does not include an evaluation of the study findings is referred to as a hybrid narrative review. So systematic review at the end gives you the study findings. So next slide. Hybrid narrative reviews provide authors with a greater freedom to interpret and integrate study results and the conclusions compared to systematic reviews, but still allow the reader to determine the authenticity of the author's findings. So they give you a bigger freedom to interpret and integrate the study results, but you can still find the authenticity of the author's findings. These are particularly important for theory development and problem identification, especially when the peer-reviewed literature is incomplete and when important studies may not use rigorous experimental or longitudinal designs. And that's one of the things about doing a peer-reviewed literature, review papers, which we will come to in a minute, that of course the number of papers that may have written on a subject may be more than just peer-reviewed papers, and they may not be that many. When I did my doctoral research, there was only one paper published on the topic in which I was researching, so I had to go to all sorts of other papers. So it's actually the ability to include a lot of different literature is important. Next slide. Steps to a successful systematic review. State the aims of the review clearly as you would a research paper. So aims are very important. This is the aim of this paper, and this is what we are trying to do. The aims will determine the choice of specific procedure used to search sources and process and present the results. In the concluding section of the study, it should be stated whether and to what extent the aims have been fulfilled. So you have your aims written at clearly at the start. These will determine, how you actually do your work. And in the conclusion section, you should be able to state whether those aims have been fulfilled and whether it has been a successful study. Next slide. In a review, the research question is included and expressed in the text, formulated as a problem, the topic and focus of the work. So this is, when you start the research question, it is very much about the whole topic of that review. What are we reviewing? The research question must correspond with the objectives of the study and be aligned with the methodology. So the research question is very much embedded in what the objectives of the study are and should be there nicely aligned with the methodology. For example, for an article investigating the quality and type of emotional bonds in young adults who use cannabis, the research question could be, can insecure emotional bonds be associated with a higher rate of cannabis use among young adults? So when you look at what the question is, that is quite a good question that is put there, and it explores those type of things. And of course, one of the things you need to think about is that whenever we write a paper, when we do the literature review section, this is a briefer version of writing a review paper. So writing a review paper is like that literature review, but it also comes up with the conclusions of what we are choosing to do. So next slide. Identifying data sources. The primary and most important sources for data are electronic databases, typically accessed through university libraries. Now, this has changed enormously over the years, and when I was a student, back many years ago, we didn't have electronic, the computers were just being used, but we didn't have those databases. So we used to have to go and look in a book, the papers that have been published the previous year, go to the librarian and say, can you get me these papers? And they would send off for the papers and they would come back and then we would have them to read. And that was typically very time consuming. Now you can imagine now, through databases, it's much, much easier. However, many of the papers you can access will depend on the levels of access granted by the universities to students and members of staff. So some universities will not have access to all the papers or all the databases. You may have access through many databases, but access to the full text may be limited to only the abstract, which may not be sufficient. And that's one of the things, that if you look at something like Google Scholar, you will come up with the abstract, the title and the abstract, but of course you won't have access to the full paper because you usually have to pay for that. And that's the advantage of being in a university. The universities will usually have got that access through paying a fee for that. Now, did I see that Salman was having problems? Someone was probably accessing the slides?
Yes, he said the slides aren't advancing for him, but I think they must be advancing for you, Dr. Pates, or you would have mentioned that.
Yes.
So it must be a connection issue. I'm sorry about that, Salman.
But it's working for me. I hope it's working for most people, and I'm very sorry, Salman. But I hope thank you, Salman. I hope that it's okay and my explanations are clear. But also, don't forget, you will be sent these. You will be sent these by Carly after the session is finished. So next slide. Now these are, and this will be a useful slide for you, which gives the databases of a number of things which are very useful: Web of Science, Medline, Scopus, EBSCO, Progress Central, PsycArticles, and these are the sort of databases you can search to find the papers that you want. As I say, you'll have this on the slides when you receive them. Next slide. As well as databases and full text studies, it's also possible to include conference presentations if the conference abstracts have been published. And what they quite often do now with big conferences is they will publish the abstracts, sometimes in advance, sometimes at the same time as the conference. Some journals may not accept these if they did not go through a peer review process. Now, in most big conferences, there is a peer review process for the papers they accept, and so those abstracts should have been peer reviewed. So, for example, I'm on the program committee of the Big Lisbon Conference, which is a very large conference held every 2 years, and we peer review all of those papers that we get that people want to present. You may also include monographs, articles in peer-reviewed non-indexed journals, sometimes they're not indexed, handbooks and manuals related to the topic, graduate theses and dissertations. These can be included in the category records identified through other sources in the Prisma study flow diagram. And one of the things about theses and dissertations is often that people, when you're doing a thesis, and I'm sure most of you have done that at some point, you do go into a subject very closely and very clearly and can often provide very useful information about what you've found. So although some of these things will not be peer reviewed and some of these may not be easily accessible, however, they will be in libraries somewhere. And for some topics, handbooks and manuals, especially if you're looking at policy, can be very useful. Next slide. Determining the selection criteria, year of publication, designating the period that is under study may be the first criterion. So you might say, we will only look at papers published in the last 5 years, say since 2016. Or you may say we'll go back to 2010. That depends very much on the topic you're researching. So clearly, if you were writing a paper on COVID, you wouldn't need to go back before 2019 because there won't be any papers. However, if you're conducting research on the development of needle exchange, you would need to go back many years. So it depends very much on the topic that you're doing. Number of citations of the article, this can be found under the databases, is usually under the heading Times Cited. And articles with a greater number of citations usually report on more prestigious research. So articles that have a greater number of citations are often the more important ones. Keywords reflecting the terminology in a given field also help identify the most relevant studies. And that's one of the things that I say to people when they're writing their paper, their research paper. Don't forget to include keywords. And keywords shouldn't just be something that you think of at the end. Oh, I must remember some keywords. They're actually really important because these are the things that will pick out your paper if someone is going to then quote it in future. So keywords are very important. Next slide. Relevance of the article. Databases may turn up a number of articles, but because of the potential overlap of keywords and other parameters, some work may be consistent with the focus of the review. And that's one of the problems about people writing keywords. Sometimes they're very slapdash about it, they're very careless, and they do need to be very focused on what it's about. Necessary to read through all the articles or abstracts to exclude irrelevant work. Quite often you can exclude it by reading the abstract, and you could say, no, this isn't to do with my review. But you may need to read the paper as well to get that exact. Type of publication. Although you may work with original and review studies only, specific topics may require information from annual reports, research reports, or guidelines. It's important to state these factors in the description of the procedure. Next slide. Study design. Research studies may be further divided into subcategories, e.g. reviews versus original works, or clinical issues, or cross-sectional studies versus longitudinal studies. So there's a whole range of research stuff which I'm sure you've come across, but we need to actually examine what we're looking at. Language of publication. Languages that predominate in science are science publishing are English and Spanish, with Chinese emerging as a significant language of science. Web of Science databases provide the option of searching studies in Chinese. And this is an important issue. One of the things that if you are an English speaker, it is a great advantage because you will be able to read a lot of these papers. But there are papers that are published in other languages, and particularly if there is a language of a country where the journal is just published in that country, there may be interesting findings, but you may not be able to access them. So that is always a question about how thorough that review may be. So next slide. Sociodemographic environment. It's useful to describe the sociodemographic environment in which the research study was conducted, as this may influence the research results. So if you're looking at, I don't know, working class people in a particular area, you maybe need to describe that if you're trying to compare it with a more affluent sample in a different area. The review needs to take this into account when presenting the research findings. Funding sources and conflicts of interest. The funding source of the study and other conflicts of interest may influence how the results are interpreted. Significant biases have been uncovered when the funding source or authors have a financial stake in the results of the study. And this is becoming I think it's becoming a bigger issue, because if you think about the alcohol beverage companies, tobacco companies, pharmaceutical companies, they may all be interested in the outcome of your research because it may influence what people think about that. And certainly, if you look back at the way that things like smoking were presented 50 years ago, it was completely different. It was presented as a healthy thing to do, which is certainly not the case now. But it is also significant that a lot of research, or not a lot of research, but some research is funded by some of these companies, and they are clearly not going to have it published if it does not give them a positive view of their field. So given that we are a particular field in addiction of dealing with alcohol and drugs and tobacco and pharmaceuticals, it is something that we do need to take into account. Next slide. Now, this is probably not particularly easy for you to see, but it is called a Prisma flow diagram. And when you get the slides, you'll be able to see it. And what it is recommended that when you do a review paper, you include this flow diagram, which shows how you've identified the papers you've used. So the first box is records identified through database searching, and the number there, and then additional records identified through other sources. So you've got the whole of the records after duplicates are removed. You then screen them and you exclude them according to your inclusion or exclusion criteria. You put the full text articles assessed for eligibility. You exclude those which don't come up to your standards. Studies included in the qualitative synthesis, and then you end up with the studies included in the quantitative synthesis of the study. So you go through a process of selecting papers from either databases or from wherever, and you describe how you do it. And this has been a really useful diagram, and it is used extensively now in review studies because people can understand where you got your data from and how you excluded it. And I'm sorry it's so small on that, but when you get the slide yourself, you should be able to see it a bit more clearly. That diagram, I think, was taken from the book Publishing Addiction Science, which we mentioned at the beginning of the program, which is available free of charge from the Ice Age website. Okay, next slide. Interpretation of the results. As well as a Prisma diagram, results should be further summarized in a structured form like a table, according to classification criteria. It's advisable to compare the qualitative and quantitative perspectives of the study, because you may have both and you need to actually sort of summarize what you've taken from where. When using the quantitative perspective, follow the number of studies that used a longitudinal versus cross-sectional design. So you're looking at the design of the studies when they were written and how they were made up. How many studies used a standardized methodology versus one developed for the study? And how many studies balanced the participants in terms of representativeness and how many did not? So there's all sorts of variables when you need to look at, is it a standardized methodology, or did someone, because it's a new subject, develop their own methodology? Are the participants representative? Can you generalize it, and how many did not? So all these things are quite important to include. Quantitative studies make it possible to look for broader aspects of the work and find the subtleties in the results that have been ascertained. And we did qualitative research last time, and I think it is a really fascinating way to look at our field. And it is also very important to include those in review papers. Next slide. Interpretation of the results. Interpretation of results should always be based upon results and findings specified in a given study. You must refrain from adding any conclusions of your own, because the principal rule is to preserve and express the original author's ideas as precisely as possible. So although you may be tempted to add your own interpretations of those studies, you must refrain from doing that. When formulating ideas and working with other review studies, you should look at the primary source and interpret its results. Other review studies may serve as an inspiration for classifying your results rather than being their source, functioning rather as background material. So you may include other review studies, but they are really a background material of the work that you're talking about. Next slide. Any copyright rules should be observed when making citations. Strictly avoid using findings presented by the original authors in their research as your interpretations. Remember that copyright, when you have submitted a paper to a journal that's been accepted, the copyright remains with the journal. So you be careful about make sure you cite things correctly. Avoid using findings presented by the original authors in their research as your interpretation. So you must make sure you cite them, and this is their interpretation of the work. You should seek to be as accurate as possible and restate the author's original argument, looking up other relevant works on the topic that you will cite in the same way. Necessary to be sensitive when interpreting the results from different sociocultural settings. Be careful not to make unreasonable generalizations and interpret the results in terms of a given social context. And this is really important because we know one of the things we've talked quite a lot about is how generalizable are the results of a particular piece of research, because they may only be relevant to the particular people in that study, or they may be generalizable across the field. Next slide. Once the results have been processed and interpreted, you need to think about the results and compare them with the conclusions drawn by other relevant studies. This requires you to bring a new perspective to the subject under study, singling out and discussing the most salient findings from the results. So what your review paper does is that you've taken all the results that other people have found and you've compared them and contrasted them, and you are then bringing what are the most salient findings, what are the most important things you found from doing this review paper. Importantly, the discussion should compare and evaluate the results against other relevant research projects rather than against the presentation of the author's opinions on the issue. So it's not your opinions, it is about the contrast against other research projects. Next slide. Each idea or result presented in the article needs to be properly cited too. The conclusion consists of a practical evaluation of the study. It should not contain any new findings or evidence. So you are not there, this is not a research paper, it is a review paper. So you're only reporting what has been cited there. Its purpose is to briefly summarize the results and contribution of the study as a whole, and important to practice communicating your own views concisely. So as we've said before, discussion and conclusion are very important, especially the conclusion, because it summarizes what your study, what your review paper has drawn, what conclusions you've drawn from reviewing all this literature. Next slide. The conclusion often includes recommendations resulting from the study for further research and tips for practice. It's also advisable to highlight the unique contributions of your review. And one of the things we've said over and over again is that when you've done a piece of research, whether it's a piece of original research or writing a review paper, why is your work important? And you must never be modest about this. Your work is important. You spend a lot of time doing it, and you're making a contribution to the science. Remember to study carefully the instructions for authors from the journal where you intend to submit your paper. That's what I said earlier. Some journals prefer separate discussion and conclusion section. Others prefer to combine them. What I quite like for my journal is at the end is have a discussion section, then a conclusion section, or then a limitation section, then a conclusion section, and have them in the limitation and conclusion section are just a brief paragraph, but they're important. And so I think actually a separate conclusion section really perhaps adds a bit more punch, a bit more power to it. Next slide. Potential problems. problem that may be encountered when comparing results between studies is the difference in the number of participants. Many studies do not use a representative sample of participants. The great differences in their sizes may strongly affect the study generalizability. So one of the problems is that when you have a huge difference in the number of participants, so one has used 500 and another has used 40, you could be careful about generalizing that. Citation bias may significantly compromise the results. Try to avoid this if you want to arrive at a conclusion that is relevant to the field. And we've talked about citation bias when we were talking about literature reviews, but you make sure that you don't bias the selection of papers you've cited so that to a view of your own. You are an independent person in this, and you want to, pardon me, really cite the work accurately. If there is a citation bias, peer reviewers are likely to discover it. Next slide. It's also necessary to consider the interpretation process, to consider during the interpretation process, the statistical versus clinical significance of studies. In a large number of cases, you will find results are not reflected in clinical practice despite being significant. It's therefore important to maintain contact with clinical practitioners to be able to compare the results with real life. You can formulate how these significance correlate in the conclusion. And this is always an interesting thing, because I don't know how many of you are just academics or how many are clinicians as well, but sometimes as clinicians you find that your clinical sample is different from that stated in scientific papers. And this is partly because there is always inclusion and exclusion criteria in papers. So, for example, years ago, we did a study on amphetamine and prescribing for amphetamine users, and we excluded people with mental health problems because this would have biased the results. However, during our clinical practice, we did see quite a lot of people with mental health problems. So you have to think about this. What is the difference in clinical and clinically significant and statistically significant findings, and you can then actually include these in your conclusion, and this actually makes it more interesting for the reader, that shows that you've gone that extra step for that. Next slide. Prediction sciences, the critical evaluation of systematic reviews is important. It's a key to the correct interpretation of selected data from particular studies, provides background for comparing findings. It can help identify potentially disproportionate or inhomogeneous interpretations of findings. So sometimes if you find between different studies there are differences that are disproportionate, or they don't correlate with each other, you as a reviewer can actually highlight this and highlight the fact that it is a field that may have disproportionate studies, disproportionate findings. The tendency to interpret data in a different way and present specific points of view can be a potential source of bias. E.g., contrasting studies in the area of tobacco policy depends on whether the study was or was not funded by the tobacco industry. So that goes back to what I said earlier. It's always useful to point out what the potential source of bias may be. Next slide. That's the end of the slides. Sorry, that was quite a long session. Anybody got any thoughts or questions? Okay. Can everyone still hear okay? I hope so. Right, if there are no questions on that, and you will have that. I'm sorry, it was a long paper. Sorry, it's a long session. We covered a lot, and it's quite difficult language. Sorry,
hello, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Yes. My question is, are there any ethical guidelines in reviews, systematic reviews?
That is an interesting question, and I don't think there are any specific ethical guidelines for that, other than what you would use for other studies. But it'd be worth looking in the Publishing Addiction Science chapter on writing reviews, and that should mention that. I will have a look at that, and we can raise it next time if I find that for you. I don't know offhand, but I will look it for you. I'll look at it for you, and I can raise it for the next session for you.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone have any other questions? If not, we will go on to Stephen's paper. I don't know if you've all had the paper. Stephen kindly sent us a paper on internet addiction, relationship with depressive symptoms during the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown among young adults in Nairobi County, Kenya. And this is a very interesting subject because, again, given what we just been talking about review papers, you wouldn't have been doing a review paper on this or any paper on this 3 years ago because COVID wasn't known. So this is a very much a topical paper. And of course, the whole idea of internet addiction is also something which is relatively new because, of course, the access to the internet in a comprehensive way, the way it is now, is a relatively new phenomenon. So Stephen's read a very, very interesting paper for us, and I thank Stephen for that. And it is generally a well-written paper. And what I will do is I will send Stephen the individual comments on grammar and those sort of things later on. But what I wanted to do was just to highlight a few specific things. And one of the things you'll find in the abstract, in the results, he says, for depression, 17.5% of respondents reported clinical depression, with 34.2% reporting moderate depression and 48.3% reporting normal levels of depression. Now, I think that's an interesting question because you must ask what normal levels of depression are, and I suspect that may not be a very accurate finding in the sense that, or not finding, but a way of reporting, because I don't know what normal levels of depression are. Does that mean that they're more severe than moderate or they're less severe? So I think that language needs to be changed slightly. Then if we go down to the background of the study, there's a sentence that I have, which is at the bottom of the page. This has been attributed to factors like having too much free time on, and then it says ease of use as they are the digital age. And then it looks like there's something missing from that, and I'm not quite sure what that sentence means. Oh, that's flicking up and down. It's in the first paragraph of the background of the study.
Oh, the first paragraph, thank you.
So I think you need to look at, I think there may be something missed out there. There you are, at the bottom of the paragraph. Ease of use as they are the digital age, and I'm not quite sure what that means. So as you see, Stephen, a lot of these points are very minor, but they maybe need to be clarified. At the end of the next paragraph, we have leading sort of, social media, especially with the entertainment platforms for interaction, becoming more popular, leading them to use it more, and all this may have created dependence and therefore addiction. And I think there is a bit of a problem with terminology here. I personally have a problem with addiction when it is applied to things other than substances, because I'm not convinced that shopping addiction or sex addiction are real addictions. They may be more compulsive behaviors, but that's me as a psychologist. But that's fine, because internet addiction is a generally used phrase now. But you've got created a dependence and therefore addiction. And is a dependence different from an addiction? So I think that needs, again, to be clarified. On the next page, there's a paragraph that begins, in Africa, the internet usage is still scanty. At the end of that paragraph, you've got other studies have shown that students who spent less time online engaged in academic activities are more likely to be affected, increasing their risk of internet harmful addiction. And I'm not quite sure what that means. Does that mean that people who spend less time online are more likely? Well, it doesn't quite make sense to me because there's a bit of a contradiction there. So I think that sentence needs to be examined and perhaps rewritten. In the next paragraph, you have the study and it's halfway down the paragraph, the study indicated that stressed and depressed teens are likely to have psychological problems like problem internet use. And this is a bit circular because have they already got psychological problems being stressed and depressed? And does internet use make it a greater problem? And then further down that paragraph, we have noting that poor internet users often show negative consequences like poor social and academic performances. And I put a question mark saying, does that mean financially poor internet use? And if it does, it needs to be, say, financially poor or economically poor, because poor internet users is not a very clear phrase. In the methods section, you have a wonderful mistake here. If you've got Nairobi city ranks highest in urban population of 4,397 million, which makes the population of Nairobi being at 4 billion. And I think you meant 4.397 million. Just a very minor point, but it does make a huge difference. And then later on in that paragraph, you've got, due to time and cost constraints, the sample will be purposely drawn from urban areas. Now, clearly that was taken from when the study was being proposed, so you must change that to the past now the study's been done. You'll see that I'm being quite pedantic with this, but this is to help you, and I will send you all these things. And as I've always said, it's better to get someone else to review your paper before you submit it. Now, table 1. I don't understand it. It has problematic impairments, internet use, problematic internet use, social impairment, problematic internet use, emotional impairment, problematic internet use, impulsivity. Got the number, which is 349, which is the number of subjects. Then you've got a mean and a standard deviation. But I don't know what it's a mean of or what is a standard deviation of. I think that needs to be clarified. The point about tables is they should always be a way of clarifying the information in the paper. And if tables aren't clear, then they're not. It doesn't help. And prevalence of internet addiction. You've got a very high prevalence in Kenya. And it's interesting because when all the other papers you have reviewed, and you've done a very good job on that, show much lower levels than you have in Nairobi. Prevalence of depressive symptoms. Now, again, you've got normal levels, moderate levels, and clinical levels. Now, this is in table 3, sorry. Now, prevalence of depressive symptoms, your total number is 348, which is just one short of the one that you should have there, so maybe that should be 349. Normal levels, does that mean non-depressed? And if that's the case, it should say not depressed rather than normal levels of depression, compared to moderate levels of depression or clinical levels of depression. Clinical and normal are very valid, but normal doesn't mean anything in terms of depression. It's I assume it means non-depressed. And then the problem on table 4, I found this a bit confusing as well. One of the problems is that you've done, and what I see commonly in papers submitted to me, is that probabilities should never be expressed as zero values, and probabilities should never be expressed as equals. Probabilities should always be p is less than 0.01 or 0.001 or 0.005 or whatever. So those need to be corrected to what the proper levels are. They can't be zero, because what they are is, as the word suggests, it's the probability that this result will be found. So it can never be zero. I think that you say that the study found a weak and significant relation between depressive symptoms and internet addiction and all domains of probably internet use. And this is a really interesting finding. But without knowing what the proper probability levels were, we don't know how weak or significant that relationship was. So you need to put in the proper figures there. Then the thing that is really interesting is, of course, that you've concluded in the discussion that so I've got a very bright light on my desk here because the sun is very bright. Yeah, you had according to analysis, the amount of severity of young adults internet use, the bulk of them, 46.5, had a moderate internet addiction, followed by a mild internet addiction, 31.2%, average internet addiction, 18.5. Now, then a severe internet addiction of 28.5. Now that accounts for more than 100%. So that needs to be looked at and corrected. That's I think it's the fourth paragraph. 1, 2, 3, 4. The other thing that you need to be careful of, and this applies to everyone, is not to include new papers in a discussion section. Should those papers be, they should be in the introduction section unless they relate specifically to your findings. So it's just a thought to be aware of. Now, one of the things that I like very much is that Stephen quite clearly says at the end, we cannot conclude causality in this relationship. But what I would do is I would actually, and you're quite right to have that. That's just the last sentence in the discussion section. But what is really important is the fact that you have found there is a link between internet use and depression, and I think it will be worth, and this is what we will say, just in your conclusions, to say why your study is important. You found that, but we don't know whether the internet use causes depression or people who are depressed use the internet more. So it's really worth highlighting that. So overall, I think it's a really interesting paper, Stephen. Thank you very much for allowing us to look at it. I hope you don't think I've been too precise with my critique, but it's what I hope is that it will make it a much better paper, and I will certainly send you the all the comments on the paper that I've made and any some smaller grammatical points. So thank you, and this is open now to discussion from the group. If
we have some good stuff in the chat, Dr. Pates.
Right, so I need to look at that.
Yeah, we've got a few questions about the first part about the presentation that you gave.
I'm trying to find the chat.
Okay, if you like, I can read them.
Okay, I've got the chat here. Let's have a look. Ooh. Okay, from David, how many studies are suitable for a systematic review? Minimum studies to be reviewed. Now, that's a very interesting question. It does, and I think it depends very much on how much has been written. Clearly, if there's been very little written, then you have to include everything that's written, I suppose. I don't think there is a minimum number, but you obviously need, you couldn't do a review study with less than perhaps half a dozen papers. So that's actually more it's difficult without knowing what papers are actually available for that. Hybrid narrative reviews are really the ones that don't have the conclusions of the systematic reviews. When we think about the systematic reviews that we've done, we come up with conclusions from the results of the studies that have been found. We don't put figures on these because that would be more of a meta-analysis. But a hybrid narrative review is really looking at what the issues are that we have been discussing in the paper. So it's a useful study to find out what the issues are rather than what the results are. So that is the difference really between a hybrid narrative review and a systematic review. In my setting, Nigeria, access to resource database is very limited and can be a pain in finding peer-reviewed articles. How to navigate this? Charles, I agree with you entirely. In many areas, it is difficult. And the difficulty is that that universities are the ones that have access to these, and of course that will depend on the resources of the university. And I quite accept that universities in Africa and Nigeria and other parts of Africa will have more limited resources to be able to find them. So I think it is difficult to do a good review if you have limited access to resources. You may be able to do it by going through the abstracts, but you have to remember that the abstracts may be limited in what they can provide. And I'm sorry, I'm not able to give you a definitive answer, but the reality is that the databases are really important to get through writing a successful review paper. We reduce ResearchGate various, otherwise we majorly rely on Google Scholar, and it's really interesting from that Google Scholar is now very commonly used, and I certainly, if I want to look up something very quickly, I would use Google Scholar, and it is useful, and of course it is free. Anyone can go onto Google Scholar and find it, so that is a very useful resource. Hybrid narrative reviews different from scoping reviews. I guess a scoping review is looking at what is the papers talking about. But I guess they're more or less the same thing that you're talking about. In both of them, you're talking about what are the issues in this review paper that you've done. What are the things that will come out from this review? What are the issues that are important in the field that we're discussing? So I would not particularly differentiate them. And thank you, Salman, for your review, for submitting your paper. Are there any other comments? Or Stephen, did you find my review a bit hard?
Yeah, I really appreciate your review. And I've taken note of the points. I think one part that you've cited on the discussion section, I just needed clarification. Did you say we should not introduce new literature in the discussion, but it should be coming from the background?
Yeah. What you should do is only introduce new topics if they relate to the results that you found from any paper. But I mean, that's a debatable thing. It's not a major thing, and people do it all the time, Stephen. So don't worry about that. That's not a major criticism. And it is an interesting and well-written paper. And I think one of the good things about this series of webinars we have, if we get a chance to discuss people's papers, then you'll get a better chance of getting them published, because it is what I've said, and it is not just for less experienced researchers, but I would never submit a paper myself, and even though I've had lots of papers published, I'd never submit a paper without asking a colleague or someone else to read it and comment on it. So these things only strengthen what you are actually able to submit. And I thank you ever so much, Stephen, for your for submitting the paper to us. And I will come back to you with what I'll do is I will go through the paper and I'll highlight in a different color any changes that I think need doing.
Okay, that's very much appreciated.
No, I appreciate you submitting the paper to us. Any other thoughts? Any other questions? We have 3 sessions left of this series of webinars. What I will do next week is talk about how do you respond to the reviewers when you get your paper back. Remember that of all papers submitted, very few get accepted first time. There's nearly always comments that come back. And so I'm going to do a session on responding to the reviewers' comments and how the best way to tackle that. The session after that, we're going to do a session on ethics, which is really, really important. And the last session I'm going to do, and I'm going to give you the opportunity, I'm going to do a session on what it's like to be a reviewer. And I will also offer you the chance, if you want to review a paper or two, then I'll let you review a paper for my journal. So it gives you a bit of live experience of that. So those are the topics for the last 3 sessions of the webinar. So any questions, please ask either Carly or myself. And one thing I want you to know is that when this series of webinars is finished, I hope you'll all have my email and you can remain in contact with me. And I see Salman has his hand up. Salman.
Thank you so much, Professor Richard and Carly. And again, accept my apology for being absent for a few sessions because the time difference and the internet issue that I was currently facing. One thing that I want to know, Richard, if I want to submit my manuscripts in each issue, is there any restriction of submitting the manuscript, the number of articles in your journal? Is there any restriction?
Well, the number from one person.
Yeah,
Or
so
the
from one person, but because I have many co-authors with me, 2 to 3 co-authors, and can we submit the manuscript in each issue?
No, there's no restriction on the number. What I wouldn't do if I had 3 papers from one person, I wouldn't put them all in the same issue. But if you've got a lot of authors and they're also maybe they're taking turns in being the first author, then that wouldn't be a problem. But it's generally not a problem, Salman. It's because one of the things about big studies or even things like doctoral dissertations is they can produce a lot more than one paper about the same subject. And I very much appreciate when people take the time to write papers and contribute to them. So no problem.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Because currently we are preparing 3 manuscripts and planning to submit it to your journal. So it came to my mind and I asked you this question because thank you so much.
Okay, that's fine.
Thank you
That's
so
fine.
much.
That's okay. So any other questions or thoughts? If not, we will leave it this week and we'll see each other in 2 weeks.